The figure of the vampire, an undead entity sustained by the blood of the living, has captivated our imagination for centuries. Yet the sleek, seductive, and often aristocratic vampires populating modern Hollywood screens have almost no resemblance to their terrifying medieval predecessors. Today's vampires are figures of glamour, pale, elegant beings who bestow immortality or offer a thrilling, cursed existence. Their medieval ancestors, however, were grotesque manifestations of disease and reanimated corpses, bloated and putrescent, that spread plague and death through entire communities. This transformation from rotting peasant to romantic aristocrat reflects a profound shift in humanity's deepest anxieties. Medieval fears were primal and immediate: death, disease, and the breakdown of community in a world where life hung by a thread. Modern fears, while still acknowledging mortality, lean toward the existential and the seductive, the alluring darkness that might steal our humanity or offer forbidden eternity. To understand how we arrived at today's glittering immortals, we must first descend into the charnel houses and plague-ridden villages where the vampire legend truly began. Long before Bram Stoker's Dracula swept across Victorian drawing rooms, Eastern Europe harboured a chilling belief in creatures known by many names: Upir, Vordelak, Ugol, and Strigoi. These were the original vampires, and their horror lay not in sophistication or seduction, but in their visceral, pestilential nature. They were the walking embodiment of humanity's most primal terror, that death itself could be violated, that the boundary between life and the grave was horrifyingly permeable. Far from being gaunt and ethereal, these early Slavic revenants were typically described as bloated, ruddy, and disquietingly corporeal. Their skin, rather than being deathly pale, might be flushed or even purple, their bellies distended as if engorged with some unholy substance. Some accounts spoke of eyes that remained open and glassy, or even a subtle twitching of limbs, hinting at an animation that defied natural decay. Fresh blood might seep from their mouths, not the elegant trickle of Gothic romance, but a grotesque overflow suggesting recent feeding. They might appear to have grown new skin, hair, and nails, looking alarmingly fresh despite their interment, or conversely, still decaying yet unnervingly active. This corporeal horror was central to their terror. These were not sophisticated beings who hypnotized their victims with mesmerizing gazes. They were unsettling, malformed entities, a macabre mockery of life, an affront to the natural order of death and decomposition. Their primary hunger was not always for blood in the modern sense, but for the life force of the living itself, manifesting in various destructive ways that went far beyond individual predation. The greatest fear associated with these Slavic revenants was their devastating capacity to spread disease and death throughout an entire community. They were not solitary hunters stalking lone victims in the night. They were harbingers of plague, inexplicable sickness, and widespread demise. A sudden outbreak of illness, a village mysteriously succumbing to virulent contagion, crops withering in the fields, livestock dying en masse. These were the signs that an UPIR was active and feeding. The revenants' victims were typically their own family members and neighbours. Rather than wandering far afield, these creatures remained tethered to their earthly lives, visiting their former homes to physically assault sleeping relatives, or, more insidiously, to drain the vitality from everyone around them. The bloated appearance itself was sometimes linked to the accumulation of disease within the corpse, making it a walking, infectious biohazard. They weren't just preying on individuals for sustenance, they were literally infecting the land and its people, turning entire settlements into graveyards. This collective threat, a silent, pervasive killer that could decimate a village, made revenants truly terrifying, in a way modern vampire fiction rarely captures. When your neighbour died of mysterious causes, and your livestock began perishing days later, when your children sickened with fever and more graves needed digging each week, the horror was not abstract or romantic. It was immediate, existential, and demanded action. This was the mindset of the medieval person at the time, which explains the often horrific actions which followed. They might have started simply with prayers or common measures for safety. However, when they felt that their spiritual protections had failed, When a body was suspected of being a potential revenant, medieval communities resorted to drastic, often horrific post-mortem rituals. These measures reflect both the existential threat revenants posed in their minds and the practical, visceral nature of medieval life, where death was an ever-present reality and desperate times demanded brutal solutions. Against the pervasive dread of malevolent spirits and revenants, communities employed both religious and folk protections. Garlic, renowned for its pungent aroma, was widely used, hung above doorways, rubbed on windows, or eaten regularly. Its strong scent was considered anathema to dark forces and thought to ward off contagion, evil eyes, and early revenants. Holy water, blessed by priests and infused with divine power, was sprinkled on people, animals, and property to purify and repel demons. Crosses, relics of saints, and fervent prayers were equally vital, invoking God's protection and solidifying the Church's role as a primary bulwark against supernatural evil. Beyond that, they took often gruesome physical measures. When prevention failed and suspicion arose, perhaps after a series of unexplained deaths or misfortunes, communities would exhume the suspected corpse. What they looked for were the horrifying signs of undeath, an absence of proper decay, a ruddy or bloated appearance, fresh blood around the mouth, open eyes, or a pliable body that should have been rigid. The cure was equally brutal and pragmatic. Staking through the heart or stomach was the most common method, intended to pin the corpse to the earth and prevent its rising. Often a hawthorn or oak branch was used, driven through with desperate force. Iron nails might be hammered through the limbs or heart, since iron itself held symbolic power against evil. Decapitation was another terrifying but trusted method. Severing the head was thought to permanently incapacitate a revenant, rendering it blind and immobile. The detached head might be placed between the corpse's legs, buried separately, or even burned to ash. Sometimes garlic cloves would be placed in the mouth, though its prophylactic power was less universal than in later myths. Reburying the body face down was believed to confuse the creature, causing it to dig deeper into the earth rather than up toward the surface. Placing poppy seeds, millet, or grains in the coffin was another tactic. Folklore held that the revenant would be compelled to count each seed, a task that would occupy it until sunrise, when it would be forced back to its grave. In the most extreme cases, especially for persistent hauntings, or when plague ravaged a community, the body would be exhumed and burned completely. Destruction by fire was the ultimate solution, ensuring no physical form remained for the malevolent spirit to inhabit, thus guaranteeing eternal cessation. These were not mystical rituals performed by occult specialists, but desperate visceral acts carried out by ordinary villagers, the blacksmith, the gravedigger, the merchant. They reflect a worldview, now very strange to us, in which the boundaries between life and death were frighteningly permeable, and in which the community's survival sometimes required desecrating the graves of their own neighbours and family members. While Eastern Europe spawned the most widespread revenant traditions, Britain contributed its own distinctly earthy strain of vampire lore. Croglin Grange, a remote estate nestled deep within the brooding landscapes of Cumberland, England, serves as the stage for one of Britain's most chilling vampire legends. Unlike the elegant foreign counts of later literature, the vampire of Croglin Grange was a creature of raw, persistent terror, embodying a peculiarly English horror rooted in landscape and locality. The legend, dating to the late 18th or early 19th century, begins with the Cranswell family renting the secluded Grange. One summer evening, Miss Cranswell, alone in her bedroom, was startled by two piercing points of light outside her window. Transfixed by inexplicable dread, she watched as a grotesque figure materialized from the darkness, a withered, emaciated creature, its skin stretched parchment-like over sharp bones, eyes burning with unholy intensity and unmistakable hunger. With chilling persistence, it scratched at her leaded window pane, not with supernatural force, but with horrible, patient determination. To her mounting horror, it forced a pane open, and long, bony fingers reached through the gap. Paralyzed by terror, she watched as the abomination slipped inside, moving with unnatural fluidity. It glided to her bed and fell upon her without preamble or seduction, its fangs sinking into her neck in a brutal siphoning of life that left her weak and screaming. Her brothers rushed in at her cries, but the creature, disturbed in its feeding, slipped back out the window and vanished into the night. Shaken and traumatized, the family initially tried to rationalize the incident as nightmare or hallucination brought on by isolation and stress. They even left the Grange temporarily, hoping distance would dispel the terror. Yet the vampire was not deterred. Upon their return, the attacks resumed, each more brazen and draining than the last. It is said that Miss Cranswell grew pale and weakened. The family believed they faced a relentless predator that would not simply disappear. Driven by desperate need for peace and vengeance, the brothers resolved to hunt their tormentor. The story says they discovered an ancient, neglected vault in the nearby churchyard, a forgotten mausoleum that locals whispered held dark secrets and had been sealed for generations. They staked out the area through the night, and as dawn approached, they said they witnessed the ghastly figure returning from its hunt. It slipped into the vault, disappearing within its stone confines, just as the first light touched the horizon. With grim determination, they forced open the crypt's heavy iron door, its hinges screaming in protest after decades of disuse. Inside, among several decaying coffins turned to dust, they found a single, undisturbed sarcophagus. Prying open its heavy stone lid with iron bars, they recoiled in horror and vindication. There lay the creature, its body shriveled yet remarkably preserved, leathery skin pulled tight over bones, gaunt features matching exactly Miss Cranswell's attacker. Though its eyes were closed, they seemed to hold a dormant malevolence, as if it might wake at any moment. Without hesitation, they drove a heavy wooden stake through the creature's chest. As it plunged home, a horrifying, guttural shriek echoed through the ancient stones, a sound of agony and ultimate defeat that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. The body writhed violently, limbs flailing as if fighting its own destruction, then fell utterly limp. Its malevolent existence was extinguished by the heroism of the brothers, according to the legend. The vampire of Croglin Grange, with its plausible realism and lack of romantic embellishment, stands as a testament to a grimmer, more visceral strain of vampire lore. Rooted not in aristocratic charm, but in desperate survival against a relentless bestial horror, the legend's brutal details, forced entry, direct physical attack, the discovery and extermination of an unnaturally preserved corpse, offer a chilling glimpse into local dread and the fear that death might not be final. In an era before scientific understanding revolutionized humanity's relationship with the natural world, the human mind grappled with life's most terrifying mysteries through supernatural lenses. When faced with inexplicable horrors, people sought answers, and those answers often involved divine wrath, malevolent spirits, or dark magic. This was not ignorance or foolishness as they saw it. It was a logical framework within the existing worldview, a rational attempt to impose order and meaning on a chaotic, dangerous world. It was a time when death came suddenly and without warning. A robust person might collapse in the fields, a child might sicken and perish overnight, a woman might hemorrhage in childbirth despite the midwife's best efforts. Without knowledge of bacteria, viruses, internal organ failure, or the myriad ways the human body can fail, such occurrences took on supernatural explanations. Curses, the evil eye cast by an envious neighbour, witchcraft, vengeful ghosts, demonic possession, these provided a narrative, a reason for events that otherwise seemed utterly random and unjust. If a family member died violently or mysteriously, and others in the household soon fell ill, suspicion naturally arose. Was it the restless spirit of the deceased, unable to find peace? Had they returned to drag their loved ones into death alongside them? These beliefs offered not just explanation but also action. Rituals could be performed, priests could be consulted, protections could be enacted. In a world of helplessness against invisible killers, supernatural explanations paradoxically provided agency. We see them especially when we turn our gaze towards plagues and epidemics. Plague outbreaks represented the ultimate terror of the medieval world. Diseases like the Black Death swept through populations with horrifying speed and indiscriminate lethality. A person could be healthy at breakfast and dead by sunset. Entire villages could be decimated in weeks, with mass graves unable to contain the bodies quickly enough. The sheer scale and incomprehensibility of these epidemics left no room for coincidence or natural explanation in the medieval mind. Medieval medical theories included concepts like humoral imbalances, corrupted air, miasma, and unfavourable astrological alignments. These offered little comfort and even less effective treatment. Faced with such overwhelming destruction, people turned to explanations rooted in divine punishment for collective sins, the machinations of devils, or supernatural contagion spread by evil forces. Some plagues were attributed to the wrath of God, others to malevolent witches poisoning wells, still others to the activities of revenants spreading death through their very presence. When plague struck a village and bodies were hastily buried in mass graves, only to have the epidemic persist or worsen, the living sought explanations. If a recently deceased person's grave was disturbed by animals or grave robbers, and the body appeared oddly preserved or bloated, the conclusion seemed inescapable. The dead person had become a plague spreader, a revenant that must be destroyed to save the community. Perhaps most unsettling to medieval people were bodies that did not decompose properly, as they judged it. Grave diggers, cemetery workers, and villagers conducting secondary burials sometimes unearthed corpses exhibiting deeply unsettling features that seemed to defy natural death. A bloated appearance, as if the corpse had been feeding, a ruddy or flushed complexion instead of the expected pallor, fresh blood or reddish fluid around the mouth and nose, skin that appeared fresh rather than desiccated, hair and nails that seemed to have grown, a body that remained pliable rather than rigid, the absence of expected putrefaction. These signs were interpreted as irrefutable proof that the deceased was not truly dead, but was a revenant, a vampire preying on the living under cover of darkness. Modern science attributes these phenomena to natural processes. Gas accumulation during decomposition causes bloating. Blood pooling, or livor mortis, creates reddish discoloration in certain areas. Adipocere or grave wax can form in cool, damp conditions, preserving bodies in an eerily lifelike state. Decomposition pressure can force fluids out of the mouth and nose. The shrinking of skin around hair follicles and nail beds creates the illusion of growth. A body buried during cold months might remain remarkably preserved. But in pre-scientific times, lacking any understanding of decomposition chemistry, microbiology, or forensic science, these signs were interpreted through the only available framework, the supernatural. Such bodies were often ritually mutilated, staked, or burned to prevent their return, demonstrating the visceral fear and urgent need for action these unsettling sights inspired. While supernatural explanations dominated medieval thinking, modern medical science reveals that many vampire symptoms had tragically real origins in misunderstood conditions. 3 in particular paint a chilling picture of how human suffering became monstrous legend: porphyria, catalepsy, and premature burial. Porphyria encompasses a group of rare genetic disorders arising from errors in the body's production of heme, a crucial component of hemoglobin that carries oxygen in blood. While rare today and extraordinarily rare historically, its symptoms align disturbingly well with classical vampire traits, leading some researchers to propose it as a potential origin for vampire legends. The most striking symptom is extreme photosensitivity. Sufferers, especially those with congenital erythropoietic porphyria, develop severe blisters, lesions, scarring, and progressive disfigurement when exposed to sunlight. The ultraviolet light triggers a reaction with accumulated porphyrins in the skin, causing excruciating burns. This forces sufferers into a strictly nocturnal existence, the vampire's infamous aversion to daylight given medical form. Some forms of porphyria cause skin tightening and gum recession over time, making teeth appear more prominent, larger, or fang-like. Hirsutism, excessive hair growth, can occur. The ears and nose may become eroded or disfigured. In severe cases, fingers can contract into claw-like positions. The cumulative effect of these symptoms could easily create an appearance that terrified medieval observers. Iron deficiency anemia, a common complication of porphyria, results in a characteristically pale, sallow, almost corpse-like complexion. Neurological symptoms range from anxiety, paranoia, and hallucinations to full psychosis, delirium, and aggressive behavior, manifestations that could be mistaken for demonic possession or the madness of an undead creature. Finally, a compelling but controversial detail. Some researchers have noted that certain sulfur-containing compounds can exacerbate porphyria symptoms. While the connection remains debated, it raises the intriguing possibility that garlic, rich in sulfur compounds and famous as a vampire repellent, might have had a real observable effect on sufferers of this condition, thereby reinforcing the folklore. Catalepsy, a condition characterized by a trance-like state with muscle rigidity, loss of voluntary motion, and extreme unresponsiveness, directly addresses one of humanity's most primal terrors: being buried alive. This condition can be triggered by epilepsy, severe psychological trauma, certain neurological disorders, or other medical causes. Individuals experiencing a cataleptic episode can appear utterly lifeless for hours or even days. Breathing becomes so shallow as to be imperceptible, the heart rate slows dramatically, body temperature drops, and the muscles stiffen in a rigor-like state. The person cannot respond to external stimuli, cannot move, cannot signal that they are still alive within their frozen body. In times when definitive signs of death were poorly understood, centuries before stethoscopes, electrocardiograms, or knowledge of brain death, a person in a cataleptic state could be easily and tragically seen as deceased. The implications are horrifying. Conscious burial, or burial followed by awakening in absolute darkness, in a coffin beneath the earth. This brings us to premature burial itself, perhaps the most direct and chilling explanation for many post-mortem vampire observations. The fear of being buried alive was so pervasive in earlier centuries that wealthy individuals designed elaborate safety coffins with bells, breathing tubes, and flags that could be activated from within. When an individual buried alive eventually awoke in their coffin, the ensuing struggle would be desperate and violent. Upon later exhumation, perhaps due to family members moving the grave, secondary burial practices, or investigation after plague, the body might be found in disturbing conditions that seemed to confirm vampire activity. There were multiple changes that were seen as signs of this: an unnatural position in the coffin, suggesting movement after burial, the shroud torn or pushed aside, scratch marks on the inside of the coffin lid, sometimes with fingernails torn away. The most horrifying symptom, often interpreted as evidence of blood drinking, was the presence of blood or reddish fluid around the mouth. This could result from internal hemorrhaging during the struggle, biting the tongue or cheeks in panic, or simply post-mortem fluid expulsion from decomposition. If the burial had occurred during cool weather or in conditions that slowed decomposition, the body might appear unnaturally fresh, as if it had been feeding and maintaining itself underground. The accumulation of decomposition gases could cause bloating, creating the appearance of a well-fed corpse, rather than one that had been buried for weeks. The psychological horror of these scenarios cannot be overstated. To exhume a loved one and find evidence that they had awakened in their grave, had struggled and suffered before truly dying, would have been devastating. The only explanation available within the medieval framework was supernatural. The person had become a revenant, had transformed into something evil that needed to be destroyed, rather than a victim of tragic error who deserved compassion. Of course, in a religious age, the people turned to the church also for explanations. The Christian Church's relationship with vampire beliefs represents a fascinating paradox. While officially combating these superstitions as remnants of paganism, church doctrine and practice inadvertently provided both the framework and fuel for these legends to flourish within Christianized Europe. To be fair, the church actively fought beliefs in malevolent undead, deeming them dangerous superstitions born of pagan holdovers or demonic deception. Christianity established a clear cosmology, with one god, one devil, a definitive afterlife, and the promise of bodily resurrection at the end of time, during final judgment. Undead entities preying on the living directly contradicted these fundamental tenets. Theologians and church authorities preached against necromancy, sorcery, and revenant fears, advocating instead for prayer for the dead, faith in God's plan, and trust in proper Christian burial rites. Exorcisms were performed to combat perceived demonic influence, but these targeted possession by demons, not physical undead creatures. The Church's emphasis on rational theology and centralized religious authority aimed to quash folk beliefs that challenged its doctrine or incited unchristian acts like grave desecration. Yet Christian theology inadvertently strengthened vampire beliefs in several critical ways. The concept of an unhallowed death, such as by suicide, excommunication from the Church, death without receiving last rites, or being unbaptized, often resulted in denial of proper Christian burial in consecrated ground. Such individuals were believed to be restless, unable to find peace in the afterlife, and particularly susceptible to demonic influence or reanimation as revenants. The medieval fear of damnation and exclusion from salvation readily translated into the terrifying image of one denied the afterlife returning to torment the living. If your soul could not ascend to heaven, where did it go? The folk answer at the time was that it remained bound to the corrupted flesh, creating a revenant. This connection between improper death, exclusion from church burial, and undead return became deeply embedded in European folklore. Moreover, the very concept of resurrection, central to Christian faith, provided a conceptual framework that folk imagination could warp into monstrous form. If Christ could rise from the dead, if all believers would eventually rise in bodily form at the second coming, then perhaps death's boundary was not as absolute as it seemed. This theological opening, however misinterpreted, made the idea of corpses rising from graves conceptually possible within the worldview that they held. Beyond that, Christian rituals and iconography were also absorbed into vampire folklore. The Eucharist, the ritual consumption of Christ's blood and body through wine and bread, introduced a powerful metaphor of vampiric sustenance into Christian practice. While theologically distinct, the symbolic parallel was too strong to ignore. Both vampire and believer were sustained in the medieval imagination by a kind of blood. Holy water, blessed by priests and infused with divine power, was already used against demons and evil. Its extension to vampires and folklore was natural. Crucifixes and sacred relics, already powerful talismans against demonic forces, gained perceived efficacy against vampires. The notion of an evil creature recoiling from a crucifix or being unable to cross hallowed ground stems directly from Christian ideas of purity, consecration, and divine power repelling evil. These protective elements, originally part of Orthodox Christian practice against spiritual evil, were appropriated by folk belief and inadvertently codified weaknesses into the vampire mythos. The vampire became a creature defined as much by its anti-Christian nature as by its blood drinking, by its aversion to holy symbols, its inability to enter churches, and its fear of sanctified ground. The Church's dominant role in medieval European society also created practical circumstances that reinforced vampire beliefs. As the institution controlling death and burial, Church officials and cemetery workers regularly encountered disturbing decomposition phenomena. Misunderstandings of natural processes, particularly in mass-plague graves or during secondary burials when bones were exhumed and reburied after initial decomposition, led to terrifying conclusions. Swollen, blood-stained corpses, entirely natural products of decomposition chemistry, were instead interpreted as proof of vampiric feeding. When communities faced devastating plague or unexplained deaths, local priests offered spiritual comfort through prayer and ritual, but lacked scientific explanations for the epidemic's cause or spread, limited as they were by the state of science at the time. In such crises, folk beliefs resurfaced, sometimes informed by Christian ideas of sin, punishment, and exclusion, leading to accusations of vampirism and corrective burials involving staking, decapitation, or dismemberment. Throughout all this, the Church thus occupied a contradictory position, officially denying vampire existence, while simultaneously providing the theological concepts, symbolic language, social structures, and practical circumstances that allowed the myth to persist and evolve within a Christianized world. We should acknowledge, however, that in every official sense the Church discouraged vigilante actions against the perceived danger of vampires. By the early 18th century, parish priests were forbidden from carrying out vampire-related rituals. Church officials, including priests, prelates, scholars and popes, worked to defuse vampire hysteria. The Sorbonne passed resolutions between 1700 and 1710 banning decapitation and mutilation of vampire corpses. By the mid-18th century, the Catholic Church's sceptical position became official, with Archbishop Davanzati's research helping persuade the Vatican to condemn vampire beliefs as superstition. The formal end came when Empress Maria Theresa prohibited exhumation of all vampire graves throughout her empire in the 1750s, effectively stopping official vampire hunting. The transformation of the vampire from putrid pestilence to polished predator began largely with 19th century literature, culminating in Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula. This shift represented not just a change in vampire characteristics, but a fundamental reimagining of what the vampire symbolized and whom it threatened. Earlier literary vampires had begun this transformation. John Polydori's The Vampire introduced Lord Ruthven, an aristocratic vampire based partly on Lord Byron, bringing elements of romantic poetry's fascination with the darkly attractive anti-hero into vampire fiction. The vampire became associated with the nobility, with education and culture, with seduction rather than mere predation. But it was Bram Stoker who crystallized the modern vampire archetype. His Count Dracula was ancient, powerful, and undeniably aristocratic, possessing not just supernatural abilities, but also wealth, multiple properties, and centuries of accumulated knowledge. While still a threat and a monster, he possessed charm and an almost Byronic mystique. He could appear as a sophisticated gentleman in London society. He practiced a form of seduction, particularly with Lucy Westenra and Mina Harker, that was as much psychological and erotic as it was supernatural. Stoker's Dracula retained connections to folkloric vampires in a few ways. In its vulnerability to garlic, holy symbols and sunlight, the need to sleep in its native soil, in the ability to transform into mist or animals. But he was far removed from the dirt, decay and disease-spreading nature of the medieval revenant. He was a foreign nobleman invading England, a threat to Victorian morality and women's virtue, a creature of dark sexuality and forbidden desire, rather than a plague-bearing corpse terrorizing peasant villages. This literary transformation reflected the concerns of its era. Victorian society was obsessed with propriety, sexual restraint, imperial power, and the threats posed by foreigners and the lower classes. Dracula embodied these anxieties. He was the foreign invader, the sexual predator hidden beneath aristocratic refinement, the ancient evil corrupting modern England. The horror he inspired was psychological and social rather than purely physical. If literature began the vampire's transformation, cinema completed it. Hollywood seized upon the romanticized image Stoker had created and amplified it to unprecedented heights, prioritizing visual appeal, star power, and audience identification over folkloric accuracy or historical terror. Bela Lugosi's iconic 1931 portrayal in Dracula established the template, and subsequent decades expanded and varied the template. Christopher Lee's Dracula added physical menace and eroticism. Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire, 1976, and its sequels made vampires into tragic anti-heroes, beautiful immortals wrestling with existential angst, loneliness, and their own nature. They were protagonists rather than monsters, and readers were meant to identify with them, to desire their existence despite its costs. By this point, the vampire's transformation from its medieval origins was complete. Modern cinematic vampires are almost universally depicted as beautiful, wealthy, and eternally youthful. Superhuman strength, speed, and senses are standard. Hypnotic gazes and psychological powers replace physical assault. Designer wardrobes, luxury apartments or Gothic mansions, and sophisticated tastes in art and music are as central to their identity as their need for blood. This shift reflects contemporary desires as much as fears. We no longer live in immediate terror of plague or unexplained death. Modern medicine has demystified disease and extended lifespans. Our fears have become more abstract. Aging, irrelevance, meaninglessness, the loss of youth and vitality. The modern vampire embodies the fantasy solution to these anxieties: eternal youth, timeless beauty, freedom from death's inevitability. The evolution from medieval revenant to modern vampire reveals profound changes in what humanity fears, desires, and values. To better understand them, let's revisit the medieval point of view. Medieval fears were immediate and physical. People feared actual death from disease, starvation, violence, and plague. They feared the breakdown of their community, the loss of family members, the failure of crops that meant starvation through winter. The medieval vampire embodied these concrete terrors. It was death refusing to stay dead, disease given physical form. The community member turned against their own family and neighbours. The rotting, bloated, revenant-spreading plague was a monster that reflected lived reality. People did die suddenly and mysteriously. Plagues did devastate communities. Bodies did exhibit disturbing phenomena during decomposition. The vampire myth gave these incomprehensible horrors shape, meaning, and most importantly, a method of response. You could fight a vampire through staking, burning, or decapitation. You were not entirely helpless against death's apparent return. Modern fears, by contrast, are more existential and psychological. We fear aging, losing our vitality and relevance as we grow older. We fear meaninglessness in an increasingly secular world where traditional religious explanations for life's purpose have weakened. We fear isolation despite being hyperconnected. We fear missing out on experiences, on the fullness of life, on our potential before time runs out. The modern vampire addresses these anxieties through fantasy. Eternal youth and beauty eliminate aging. Immortality provides endless time for experience, learning, and achievement. Supernatural powers compensate for human weakness and limitation. The vampire lifestyle, often depicted as wealthy, cultured, and aesthetically refined, represents escape from mundane existence into something more intense, more meaningful, more alive despite being technically undead. Sexuality and forbidden desire also play crucial roles in modern vampire narratives. The vampire's bite is presented as erotic, intimate, transformative. The exchange of blood becomes metaphor for sexual union, for boundary crossing, for submission and domination. This vampire offers not just eternal life, but eternal passion, relationships that span centuries, love that transcends death. In contrast, the medieval vampire was simply ghastly, a horror no one would want to embrace. Where medieval vampires represented death and disease, modern vampires increasingly represent life, a very intense, vivid, passionate form of life, free from mortality's constraints. They are rebels against death rather than its agents, tragic figures cursed with unwanted immortality rather than monsters spreading plague. This transformation reflects our changed relationship with death itself. Modern Western society largely hides death away in hospitals and funeral homes. We don't regularly see corpses or witness decomposition. Death has become abstract, medicalized, sanitized. Without visceral daily reminders of mortality's reality, we can romanticize immortality without confronting what existence without death might truly mean. In both cases, we should point out that the math of vampires does essentially prove that, whatever people saw, there cannot truly be a society of vampires. The core argument goes like this: if vampires need to feed even just once per month, and each feeding creates a new vampire, the population would double every month through exponential growth. Starting with just one vampire, this would mean everyone on Earth, around 8 billion people at the time of writing, would become vampires in less than 3 years. Since we are not all vampires, we can safely conclude those fears are overblown. In the bigger picture, the vampire has always been a mirror, reflecting humanity's deepest anxieties back at us in supernatural form. But the reflection has changed so dramatically that medieval villagers and modern moviegoers would barely recognize each other's monsters. The medieval vampire, bloated, rotting, spreading disease, violating death's natural boundary, embodied a world where life was fragile, death was omnipresent, and the boundary between living and dead seemed terrifyingly uncertain. These creatures represented real, tangible fears: plague, famine, the dead who would not rest, the community's fragile survival against nature's harshness. The responses to these creatures were equally visceral: exhumation, staking, burning, the physical destruction of threatening corpses. The modern vampire, beautiful, seductive, eternally youthful, offering the dark gift of immortality, embodies a world where death has been medicalized and hidden, where youth is fetishized, where the greatest fear is not dying of plague but aging into irrelevance, not the breakdown of community but isolation and meaninglessness despite connection. This vampire offers escape from time's passage, intensity of experience, and the seductive possibility that death might be optional. Both versions are products of their times, shaped by prevailing fears, available knowledge, and cultural values. Both reflect the human need to externalize and give shape to anxieties that otherwise feel overwhelming and uncontrollable. And both, in their own ways, reveal profound truths about the societies that created them. The trajectory from one to the other, from pestilence to predator, from community threat to individual seduction, from physical horror to psychological fascination, maps directly onto humanity's evolving relationship with death, disease, and meaning. As we gained control over plague and extended lifespans, as death became less visible in daily life, the vampire transformed from an embodiment of death's horror to a fantasy of death's transcendence. Yet perhaps what remains constant is this: the vampire endures because it addresses something fundamental in human psychology. We are the species that knows we will die, that watches loved ones die, that builds entire civilizations in defiance of our own mortality. The vampire, whether rotting peasant or glittering immortal, represents the violation of death's finality, the terrifying or tantalizing possibility that death is not the end. In medieval times, when death came frequently and without warning, the vampire was nightmare, death refusing to stay in its place, the grave proving inadequate to contain what should remain buried. In modern times, when death is distant and abstract until it suddenly isn't, the vampire becomes fantasy, the possibility of cheating death entirely, of remaining forever young, forever vital, forever here. The medieval vampire told us, death is terrible, invasive, contagious. The dead must stay dead or we all perish. The modern vampire tells us, death is avoidable. You need not age, need not fade, need not end. Immortality is possible, and it is beautiful. Both messages resonate because both touch the same nerve: our desperate, universal human need to find meaning in mortality, to control what cannot be controlled, to deny or at least negotiate with the inevitability that awaits us all. In the end, whether we envision vampires as bloated corpses spreading plague through our villages, or as elegant immortals offering eternal youth in their embrace, we are projecting onto them our own deepest relationship with death. The vampire's transformation from one to the other is not just the evolution of a monster, it is the evolution of humanity's self-understanding, our fears, our desires, and our endless, impossible hope that perhaps, somehow, death might not have the final word. The vampire endures because we endure, because we continue to grapple with our mortality, and because we will always need monsters to embody what we cannot otherwise express. Two vastly different creatures, two vastly different mirrors, but always, always they reflect us,